So take us back to 2018 and the experience that you all had, and what was it that came from that experience?
Sure. Well, as you might imagine, and as any university would do, we had been closely monitoring our activity for years and had been looking at financials, multi-year forecasts, looking at our cash flow in a very regular way, certainly in the entire time I was there at the university. And I would say the moment it became very real that we were indeed closing was the moment in the boardroom when the board called for a closure vote. And that was a little breathtaking. As you might imagine, the board had been looking at scenarios for months, trying to find a path forward that would be sustainable, that would give the kind of student experience that we were proud to give. And so that moment when the chair, Chip, called for the vote was breathtaking. But I would tell you that equally breathtaking was not shortly after that, after the board had cast its vote, made its decision, was when one of our sisters sort of took the floor and gave her reflection on what it meant to the Sisters of the Holy Names to be making that decision. And it was a beautiful moment. It was a moment, I think, that set the tone for the closure that we would pursue. And it was, I think, a moment that brought us all together, too, as a team in hindsight.
One of the things that President Rose and her team had done an increasingly focused and I would say sophisticated job of for the board and at the board's request was modeling our enrollment, modeling our finances as we move forward. And I think as that modeling became more sophisticated, the challenges that we faced in terms of operational deficits became clear. And the Board of Trustees would begin to creatively, in concert with management and President Rose, contemplate and consider various pathways forward that could overcome some of those hurdles as they came to light. And initially, those conversations were exciting, and they were filled with creativity and I think even hope. And as the timeline sort of moved forward and the modeling yielded sort of a harsher and harsher sense of reality, it became clear that this wasn't just about creating a diversification of revenue streams. This was at its heart financial distress and at an operational level. And as the board sort of moved through that, I would also say they were weighing the balance between what was at the heart and soul of Marylhurst University as a higher ed institution, what its values were, what its purpose was, and our ability as a board of trustees to deliver on that promise to students in a fashion that was thoughtful, appropriate, and frankly longstanding. And I think, the convergence of the understanding of our reality and the challenge that we were facing as it relates to finding alternative pathways forward that might work, and this real sense of adherence to the values of Marylhurst and delivering upon those for the students. I think finally the crescendo, each wave got a little more intense, but the crescendo really did happen in that Board of Trustees meeting when a vote was called for closure. And I think no one knew how that vote was going to go. I think there was an awful lot of introspection and sort of thoughtful mindfulness as we went into that. And it was anguishing. So it definitely stays in my mind as a very poignant memory.
So Peter Drucker often talks about the leader's responsibility to, to steward the vision, the mission, steward the resources, steward the people, in a sense, all three of those were coming together in one place, because you realized in stewarding those resources and stewarding the mission, there was a collision course that was there. Did at any point in there somebody say, let's not worry about the mission, or let's think again about resources? Or were people, as you took the vote, were people sort of realizing, yes, this is coming together?
I think the short answer is no one questioned the mission or the values. I think that was the North Star, the guiding light that everyone had followed during their entire tenure, actually, as trustees. I think we never took our eye off the ball, and I think ultimately it was sort of that alignment or lack of alignment with the resources necessary to deliver on that mission that really created the chasm and the gap for us that we recognized was no options available to us, despite us looking in extremely creative and thoughtful ways for months. We just ran out of options and ran out of time.
Melody, was there ever a time because another Drucker quote is that a leader has to state reality. And was there the temptation when you're the president of an organization is to be optimistic and say, to not state reality, but state optimism, state potential hope. Was there ever a temptation to say, if we state reality, people are going to be shocked and it's going to take us in a certain direction?
No, I was never tempted to avoid the reality, and Chair Terhune and I have laughed for 5 years plus now about my tendency to come into board meetings and to disclose a new facet of my forensics work in finding some new wrinkle, some additional systems failure or challenge that of process or lack of innovation. And I would often, as the chair like to remind me, start my president's report or end it by saying, I have never seen fill in the blank. And you have to go back to when I was hired and what the conditions were when I was hired to understand that tendency. When I was hired into the presidency at Marylhurst, the institution had been in an enrollment free fall for 4 years at that point. We peaked in 2010, 2011 at just below 2,000 students. I arrive in 2014 and we're down to 1,250. So that kind of precipitous decline is going to cause a board to hire someone who will look under every cushion and try to figure out what is going on. So that was my charge, was to diagnose the situation. So with that charge, that's what I pursued, and that's why I got quite accustomed to telling the board challenging news.
So stating reality became, in a sense, your friend, because you weren't the only one having to hold the truth of reality, and you were bringing others in to hold that with you, so that it was the wisdom of all of those that were responsible.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what I would add to that is that stating reality was my way of honoring the mission. There was no way to honor the legacy of the Sisters of the Holy Names or 125 years of a higher education institution and avoid the reality of what we were experiencing. And in addition, I would argue that there is no way to demonstrate respect and care and stewardship of our students and their experience without sharing the reality of our condition. And I think this is the challenge of leadership. This is also the privilege of leadership, is that you have the opportunity, and particularly at moments of distress. Moments of distress bring out whatever tendencies I think are natural in a leader. And I was fortunate to be given the invitation by the board to disclose what I learned. I was encouraged by them, certainly, but I also think I was aware that if I wasn't going to lead in that way, if I wasn't going to set the standard in that way, then my vice presidents wouldn't be able to do their jobs effectively. And when you're in distress, you sure as heck want your VP of enrollment and your VP of finance in particular to be telling the board the truth in the numbers. And I think that had I not been willing to set that tone, their job would have been made infinitely harder.
So, Chip, would you describe what it was like to bring the board along so that people who learned in different ways and were processing it in different ways were all brought to the same place in their understanding of what was going on?
I think we were very fortunate to have a board composed of trustees who were innately curious. I think they asked questions not just during the board meetings, but after the board meetings beforehand, emails, conversations that were probing, that were, I would say, insightful, and I would also say really demanding of transparency. And from my vantage point, when you have a board that is expecting transparency and facts, and encouraging a safe conversation where if you don't know, that's okay, just say so, I think gave certainly the leadership of the board permission to construct a dialogue that heard them, gave them voice, made sure that I think everyone had an opportunity to ask questions, but also gave them a sense of belonging as it relates to the journey that we were on. I think people handle circumstances, dire consequences in some respects, and challenges differently. I would say to a person, the Board of Trustees may not have aligned on completely how they viewed how we managed to get there in its entirety, but I would say that at the end of the day, when it mattered, the board spoke with one voice, and it was tremendously powerful. And I think from that day on, the board continued to speak with one voice, which was tremendously powerful and I think uplifting, and gave us an opportunity to close with grace.
Yeah, and it shows the power of the full disclosure and reality conversation.